Really excited to have you all with us, and thank you all for joining us. I'm so excited to introduce Heather McGhee. Heather designs and promotes solutions to inequality in America. Her upcoming book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, is now available for pre-order, so check that out. We'll put that link in the chat. From One World. It's an imprint of Penguin Random House. Her 2020 TED Talk, Racism Has a Cost for Everyone, reached 1 million views in just 2 months online. It's really important to check that out. We're gonna also put that in the chat. In 2020, she will launch 2 original podcasts on the economy and how to create cross-racial solidarity in challenging times. For 2 decades, Heather helped build the nonpartisan Think and Do tank, Demos, serving 4 years as president. I have to really give this aside because there's a great Demos report that really talks about the racial wealth gap in a really important way. It's called The Asset Value of Whiteness. We're going to try to put that in chat too, because everybody needs to check that out. Under Heather McGhee's leadership, Demos moved from their original idea for debt-free college into the center of the 2016 presidential debate and argued before the Supreme Court to protecting voting rights in January 2018, helped with pro-voter reforms in 5 states over 2 years, provided expert testimony to congressional committees, including Supreme Court confirmation and hearing in 2017, and led the research campaigns behind successful wage increases for low-paid workers on federal contracts, as well as McDonald's, Walmart's, and other chains. And Heather, led that transformation on multiple levels. Heather is also an influential voice in the media and an NBC contributor. She regularly appears on Meet the Press and Morning Joe, Deadline White House, and All In. Her conversation on a C-SPAN program in 2016 went viral, receiving more than 10 million views, and we'll share that as well. I was really excited to learn that in spring 2018, Starbucks founder Howard Schultz asked Heather to advise the company as it was designing this anti-bias training after we saw what happened with those 2 Black men in Philadelphia. And so Heather helped design and wrote a report with recommendations for 250,000 employees for Starbucks, and really helped Starbucks to see how they can apply a racial equity lens to their businesses. And this is very timely for us because our cohort in those 16 organizations have been designing racial equity organizational strategies, policy statements, and programs and projects. And so Heather, we're very excited to have you here. Thank you for being here with us. I recently talked to you over the phone, and I'm really excited about your upcoming book. Thank you for being here with us, and we will talk soon.
All right. Thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you, Jerry, Erica, Stephanie. Really such a joy to be with you, Jolie and David and others whom I have not yet met in person. Maybe some I have of the 98 participants. It's really a joy and an honor. I first want to say congratulations to the racial equity cohort that is graduating. I know you're not going far, right? It's not like a college graduation where you could pick up and move to another city. You will stay in Dallas and be in relationship with TRHT. But it really does represent an amazing investment that each of you all have made in yourselves, in your community, and in the bonds and fibers between and among you. And I know from the visibility that I've had into the process with Dallas TRHT that you've done some incredible work, and I can't wait to see what you all do next. So congratulations on this graduation today. I want to talk a little bit about a really powerful idea that in some ways I know that you all are embodying already, but I want to affirm it and I want to zoom out and put it into some context. As Jerry said, I have recently written a book. It'll be out in February. It is available for pre-order now. Please go ahead and do that so that the country knows that we still want to think about issues around race and racism even after the summer is over. It's called The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And as Jerry said, I began my career really working on issues of economic inequality, trying to find solutions to the fact that half of workers can't meet their basic needs, the fact that CEOs are paying themselves 300 times the average worker, and at times of record corporate profits, we still have 50 million people who go to work and come home in poverty. All of these economic indicators, the massive racial wealth divide, which is where history shows up in your wallet, where no amount of hard work and earnings and education is going to put a dent in a level of financial comfort and freedom that was determined by decisions long before any of us were born. All of these issues are ones where you can see a clear racial disparity, and I don't have to tell this group that. And in many ways, that's the way I thought of my work. I wanted to untangle what were bad economic policy decisions and make better ones. And I was doing it in no small part for my people, for Black people, and for all those who struggled. And I knew, as was the sort of conventional wisdom in field economic policy, that racism makes inequality worse, right? There's economic inequality that affects all working and middle class people of all races, including white folks. And then there's racism, which makes it worse. So racism accelerates inequality for people of color. But over the course of nearly 20 years, some victories, far many more losses in terms of what we were actually able to move through the halls of power and what we were really able to change in the lives of working people, it became clearer and clearer to me that we were getting it wrong. It's not that racism was an accelerant of inequality, harming people of color. It was that racism was a driver of inequality for everyone. Now, why do I say that? I say that because so many of us in the progressive economic field who look at just the history of the 20th century recognize something that, frankly, is what a lot of people hear when they hear the phrase "Make America Great Again," which is the economic part of that nostalgia. The idea that there used to be a time in this country where a white man could graduate from high school and get a good union job that paid high wages, health benefits, a guaranteed retirement pension, could afford to buy a house in his neighborhood and support a family, have vacations, save for retirement, put his kids through college debt-free, where the system worked for a certain model of family and a certain model of American. But overall, that was the result of economic policy decisions, right? Of a high minimum wage that was over double what it is today in inflation adjusted dollars, of high tax rates, 90% marginal tax rate at the top level, of big generous investments from the GI Bill to the highway system to a set of home mortgage investments and suburban development investments that made middle class life possible to tens of millions of working class people, many of them the children of immigrants who came to this country without any education or any more skill than today's immigrants. But they were given an on-ramp into an economy that was flourishing for their model. We also had strong consumer protections and antitrust so that people could start businesses and we didn't see so much concentration of wealth. And that was known as the period of an era of shared prosperity. Now, obviously, I'm going to talk about the asterisks to that social contract during that era of shared prosperity. But it really did make our economy look more like a football with a bigger middle class in the middle and a smaller number of low income and high income households. For example, CEO pay to average worker pay was about 25 to 1. Remember, I mentioned that it's 300 to 1 now. So what changed? Something obviously changed to replace the era of shared prosperity in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to what we saw in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, which is where the wealthy just ran away with income and wealth gains year after year, while most working and middle class families had stagnant and declining wages, while the costs for all of those basics that I talked about, healthcare, childcare, transportation, housing, were going up and up and up. So what happened? What changed between this era of shared prosperity and what we know as the inequality era? Now, there is a logic that has been communicated from wealthy and powerful people whose goal is to divide us. That logic says that what happened between the era of shared prosperity and the era of inequality is that Black and brown people and women started cutting in line, taking the jobs, taking the prosperity away from the people who used to have it. Obviously, that logic has created a coherent political ideology that has kept the majority of white Americans voting against the Party of Civil Rights since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. That's the story that is being tapped into with Make America Great Again, right? That used to be great. Black and brown people, indigenous claims for rights, women's rights, increasing immigration are the reason why we don't have that anymore. That's the story. It is, my friends, really importantly, a zero-sum story, right? A story where progress for one group has to come at the expense of the other. And that is such a core part of the subterranean American story that has kept us at odds and kept us with less prosperity overall, less sustainability overall. This idea that we have to take and take and take from a dwindling pie of resources, and that our competition is our fellow people, our neighbors, our fellow Americans. That idea that progress for one group has to come at the expense of the other is a core paradigm that is, of course, one of the biggest messages that is being told by the racist right wing, right? When they talk about white genocide, when they talk about the threat of replacement, right? Remember in Charlottesville, you will not replace us, right? It's this idea of a dwindling white majority that has no interest in becoming a minority in this country because they know how minorities are treated, right? That's the idea. That's not what we believe, is it? We don't believe that progress for people of color has to come at the expense of the safety, security, and flourishing of white families, of our white brothers and sisters. The data bears that out. Increasingly, white Americans view, at a time of demographic change, racial competition in a zero-sum way. People of color do not. It's not the story that we hold. And yet, what occurred to me was that when we only talk about white privilege and the advantage that racism confers on white families, the privilege of basically having the decent life that everybody wants, the privilege of being able to interact with the police without fear for your life, the privilege of being able to walk through a store without being monitored, the privilege of having a little bit of a cushion and family support, because there's always going to be somebody who's got a little bit of money in your family, no matter whether you're someone who's dropped out of high school or someone who's gone all the way through to college, right? The privilege of living in areas that are not toxic waste dumps, right? Those are not excess privilege. Those are the privileges that we all want for ourselves and our families. And when we only talk about the advantage that racism confers to people of color and to white people, and the disadvantage that it confers to BIPOC communities, I think we're telling a story that we don't totally believe, because we know that racism is such a distorting factor in our politics, in our policymaking, that it actually has created a country that has been unable to just come together and solve some of our biggest problems. It's actually messing up our ability to function as a democracy. It is making white people vote against their own interest year after year after year. It is poisoning our air, because what happens is policymakers think, well, we don't have to control the pollution from this polluter because we can just dump it over here. But of course, we're talking about air and water and soil, things that are ultimately going to be shared by all, and that if we had policymakers who cared about everyone equally, they would just tell the polluter that they had to control that pollution instead of allowing an unlimited amount. We know that racism costs everyone, for those of us who had any visibility into what was going on in the buildup to the financial crisis of 2008. That's the issue that I began working on. I saw the subprime predatory mortgages loans that were being targeted at Black and Brown communities in the late 1990s and early 2000s before anybody else cared. It was being tested and tried on the communities that policymakers and banks cared the least about. And then once they saw what a profit machine it was, it spread into the wider and whiter mortgage market, ultimately bringing down the global economy. But if anybody had cared about Black and Brown communities that were being stripped of their wealth earlier in the 2000s, if anybody had cared about the canary in the coal mine and heeded the warning, then we wouldn't have had the financial crisis of 2008. Racism makes for bad economic policy decision-making. I went to Canton, Mississippi in the journey that I took over the past 3 years to write this book, and sat with workers at an auto plant at the Nissan car factory who had just lost a union vote. That would have made them one of the biggest unionized factories in the American South, would have helped lift up the floor that globalization and union busting has been pushing down on the dwindling number of manufacturing jobs in the United States. It would have meant better wages and healthcare benefits and a say over safety on the plant. And yet I looked into the eyes of white and Black workers who told me straight up, the white folks weren't voting for it because the Black folks were. It was a very explicit articulation of one of the oldest phenomena in our economy, which is wealthy and powerful people's ability to use racial division and mistrust to stop collective action. You know, labor unions built the middle class in this country in partnership with those strong government policies I was talking about. But starting in the 1960s, white people's support for labor unions began to go down. Again, it's not a coincidence that at a time of rising diversity and more demands for equality and integration, white support for those vehicles for collective action began to pull back. The central metaphor at the heart of my book is the story that I know happened in Texas and happened all over the country, from Ohio to Pennsylvania, to Mississippi to Texas, which is when the great resort style big swimming pools that were created with tax dollars in the 30s and 40s, hundreds of them were created as part of the Works Progress Administration, and then it was sort of an arms race. You really knew you were a town on the up and up when you could have a big public pool that everyone could meet in. And by and large, those pools were segregated. And in the late 1950s and early 1960s, communities began to demand that their tax dollars, Black communities began to demand that their tax dollars created these pools and they should be furnished on an equal basis. As those decisions began to fall down from the courts, and communities, white communities, were faced with sharing the public resource of the public pool, in countless communities, instead of integrating the pool and sharing this public resource with everyone, they drained the public swimming pool. rather than let Black families swim to. Poured concrete in, seeded it over with grass. I went to Montgomery, Alabama, where the Oak Park pool was the grandest one for miles. It held over 1,000 swimmers, and it really was the heart of the community of white Montgomery. And effective January 1st, 1959, in response to a desegregation order, the town council voted to close the public swimming pool. And not just the pool, but the entire parks department for the entire city of Montgomery, Alabama. They sold off the animals in the zoo. They padlocked the recreation centers. The entire parks and recreation department stayed closed for a decade. And even when it opened back up, they never rebuilt the pool. In so many ways, brothers and sisters, I do believe that we are all living in the bottom of a drained pool. The United States used to tax the successful businesses and people in this country at a very high rate and use that revenue to invest back in things that would impact and benefit us all. But starting in the mid-1960s, we stopped that level of investment. We used to have as robust public investment as European countries, which now we know spend much more on the quality of life of their citizens, from generous unemployment insurance. When the coronavirus hit in France, more than half of workers had the kind of job guarantee that allowed them to keep being paid by their employers because the government was subsidizing it. Obviously, that didn't happen here. In Europe, they have, high levels of childcare, of free childcare, of free college, of retirement security, of housing subsidies, all of these things that were actually part of a social contract that was whites only up until the mid-1960s. Once it became not whites only, America walked away from that contract. Now, the reason why my argument is that we need to debunk the zero-sum paradigm is that when I talk about the drained public pool, when I talk about the different ways that racism has distorted our system, has distorted our policymaking, has made the country more selfish and more predatory to ourselves, obviously the people who are hurt first and worst are people of color. But now that the inequality era has become so complete, white folks aren't spared participation in the economy that we have always known. White folks are the majority of people living in poverty, the majority of people without health insurance, the majority of people who are not, working for under $15 an hour in a poverty economy that is redolent of the Jim Crow South. These issues impact us all. What was wonderful for me in the course of crisscrossing the country to research this book, The Sum of Us, is that I was able in every single area, right? The book is divided into chapters that goes through, collective bargaining and what happened so that what happened to defeat labor unions so that we went from 1 out of 3 workers being covered under a collective bargaining contract to now just 1 out of 16. What happened there? And I unearthed the racialized story that helped defeat the power of labor. But then I also end with a hopeful story of cross-racial organizing in the fight for $15 in a union, where I go to Kansas City, where I sit with Latinx, Black, and white workers who have internalized the idea that the only way for them to succeed, for them to raise their wages beyond the poverty wages that these big fast food companies would assign them, would be for them to work together. That anytime they are divided racially, then the working class is losing. And they articulated this to me. They said, we have got to have a multiracial working class coalition in this country that redefines what it means to be an American. I also go to look at, I talk about our democracy and how the foundation of a representative democracy from the very beginning of the United States had holes in the bedrock that were left there to make room for slavery and racial subjugation. And I talk about how today we do not have a functioning representative democracy because of the growing tide of voter suppression and the return of a sort of white male property requirement that is happening when we allow very wealthy people to have so much more of a say in our politics than the rest of us. Racism is undermining our democracy at every turn. And yet I also talk about these cross-racial movements, whether it's Amendment 4, the ballot initiative in Florida from 2018 that restored the right to vote for returning citizens, or public financing campaigns that allow people just like us to run for office and to be part of our democracy and to have the control to set the rules without having to be wealthy or depend on wealthy friends. There is a possibility, what I ended up calling a solidarity dividend, that was waiting for us in each of these areas. I talk about cross-racial environmental justice movements that have been able to take on big polluters like Chevron in Richmond, California, and create a Green New Deal type of framework that brings new jobs and new community wealth in to communities that have long been segregated and considered sacrifice zones. I end the book with the story of meeting Jerry and Erica, of the story of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort. For me, I in my conclusion there, I have a set of 5 discoveries that I make, but the 5th one is that we have to get on the same page before we can turn it. And that is what you all are doing. By writing a new community story of Dallas, you all are helping the stakeholders in your community get on the same page. That American history is more terrible and more beautiful than we say it has been. That we have to know what happened to put us in this place. For whose profit has the zero-sum story been sold to Americans, particularly white Americans? Who's profiting from that story and why? Why was it first created? It was first created to justify stolen land and stolen labor. But why do we need to buy it today? Who's selling it? For whose profit? And does it still serve us? Right? These are the kinds of questions that get unearthed when you do the kind of community history that has been done in Dallas. And then when you begin to envision a community free from the hierarchy of racial value, a racial hierarchy of human value, then you really do begin to see a new America, a multiracial society where we all have a sense of common purpose. You then start to unlock the solidarity dividends, whether it's cleaner air, higher wages, more secure healthcare, a real representative democracy, all integrated schools and flourishing communities, even, yes, public pools that come back because we invest in ourselves and our quality of life again. And I don't think we can do that without the kind of process that you all have been taking part in. So I end this big book, over 300 pages long, with the story of the TRHT. And I talked to Jerry and Erica and include some of their beautiful words in the final chapter. And then at the very end, I talk about the day that I was sitting in my house in my mother's house, talking to her on the very day that Representative Barbara Lee introduced the resolution in the House to create a national TRHT. And my mother's Dr. Gail Christopher, and she's the person who designed the TRHT. And, you know, for all of you who I'm sure have very specific relationships to your parents and what your parents wanted you to do with your life, and being in their shadow and taking up their legacy or not. I never thought that I would end up so dedicated to the vision that my mother put forward in the world. My job was to fix the economy. If she wanted to heal people racially, that was cool, but that was her work. But I have come to see that you can't have one without the other. You can't have economic justice without racial justice. And that we can't continue to buy into the paradigms that have been sold to us for the profit of the people who do not serve us and would exploit us. So I'm really excited to have a few moments of questions with you all. I'm so excited and eager to share the book with you and to have it be something that you all can read and talk about together and ask questions. But when I got the invitation from Jerry to be a part of this conversation this morning, I said, absolutely, clear my schedule. It must be, because I owe a great debt to the Dallas TRHT for helping give me and my readers, starting in February when the book is out, a sense of what is possible. So thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. We really appreciate you. Really excited for the book, and we have already pre-ordered, I don't know how many, countless ones for our staff, but we're definitely going to make sure that our racial equity cohort also gets some if they are so inclined. So we're going to have a few minutes with you because we know we have to, get you to your next engagement. But I want to just start with this question, particularly because I just read it, and you've been talking about like this economic component. There's a sister in Citigroup who just, a Black woman who just compiled this 20-year tally, right? That said that racism and racial bias is just since 2000 has cost this country $16 trillion, right? Is making that economic argument viable, especially since that was your field, and now like you're combining these two things, right? To talk about racism and the economy.
Listen, I think it's an important contribution to make, right? This is the Citigroup report. It's got some really dry name. I can't remember. Maybe Jerry can put the link in there.
We'll put it in the chat.
It's very important because so often things that would be in the public interest, whether it's environmental regulation, civil rights, integration, affordable housing, et cetera, the response is, well, it is going to cost us economically. You're going to pit jobs against the environment. You're going to, say that we can't afford to provide free universal healthcare or free college or free childcare, right? It's an economic versus what would be socially good. And that has made over my career, we always, when we were trying to advocate for anything, we had to go through hoops to say, well, this is actually going to create jobs, it's going to be good for the economy, et cetera, right? So that piece that the Citigroup report represents is an important one, particularly for that audience, right? For Wall Street, right? They need to see that there could be more economic gain than the status quo. But I had a light bulb moment when I realized that actually, so often, and it was always white people, usually white men, who are making that sort of pushback, right? It's going to hurt us economically, but what about the economy? They weren't really talking about the economy as the sum total of our people's, activity, goods, consumption, et cetera, right? Like the textbook definition of an economy. What they were talking about as the economy, was the current economic hierarchy as it sits, right? Their place in the economy. And so we could, throw these numbers and say, but you don't understand, if we just hired 1 million people, that would have so many more economic benefits. That would grow GDP. That would have so many more knock-on jobs effects than tax cuts. And they're like, yeah, we really like those tax cuts. You know what I'm saying, right? Because it's not actually about the economy that could be, which has much more shared prosperity, right? I mean, you really see that when you look at environment, right? You get this pushback on jobs. And it's like, climate change has already cost $240 billion a year. How is it a good economic plan to have the country burn and underwater? Like, what's the plan, right? Same with the coronavirus pandemic, right? This is a perfect example, in my mind, of racism costing everyone, right? If government and corporations had protected Black and Indigenous and immigrant people who are on the front lines of this disease, not because of our genes, but because of how we've been exposed by systemic racism, more likely to have to go to work and less likely to have health insurance, more likely to have to be deemed essential workers but be abused by employers, less likely to have clean air and water where we live, less likely to have well-funded health health infrastructure. Those are the things that have made these disparities. And because of these disparities, threat continues for everyone, right? If we had protected Black, brown, and Indigenous people, we would have this thing under more control. But, as soon as the administration realized that this was, in disproportionately impacting us, they took their foot off the brake and said, well, no, we need white people to have their freedom to not wear masks. I know I don't have to tell this to you in Texas. So anyway, I think it's so often, it's that zero-sum economic model, right? That I'm not actually worried about, whether we'll have more jobs in the country. What I'm worried about is whether or not the hierarchy, the place in the hierarchy that I currently sit in, is going to be maintained. And we've just got to make sure that as we make our case for our vision of a society, that we are coming from a different paradigm, where there is a dividend to solidarity for everyone.
No, that's great. I want to forego my questions and ask some audience questions. Julio asked, and you mentioned this already, mentioning Dr. Gail Christopher, but are there any elected officials and policymakers that are listening to racial equity teachings? Is Julio's question.
Say that one more time.
Are there any elected officials and policymakers that are listening to racial equity teachings?
Yes, there are. At what level, right? I don't know Jerry may have some ideas about who's who and who's on the up and up in in Dallas. The federal level, there, the midterm elections of 2018 put more progressive women of color, people of color in office than we've ever seen in this country. And you can listen to particularly some of the young women of color speak, and they get it. Like, they profoundly get it. At the same time, if you look at who are the co-sponsors for the HR 100, which is the resolution around the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort, that's a pretty great list of people as well. And that includes some white folks too. I do think that movements, particularly the movement for Black Lives, but also the movement for, Indigenous sovereignty and water protection, the immigrant rights movement, the Families Belong Together movement, these movements have shifted national consciousness. I was deep in the data, and it is real, right? White folks woke up this summer in the millions, right? 26 million Americans took some part in a Black Lives Matter protest this country. That is massive. And most of them were in majority white counties. So this is our time. This is our time to demand things that haven't been demanded before, and to do things that we haven't been able to do before.
Speaking of another demand and economic solution, James asked, do you think reparations are part of the solution to racial economic disparities that we have in the United States? And he also mentioned folks that claim to be supportive of Black Lives Matter, but also are against reparations. So what do you think? Yeah.
Very good question. So I think that the white opposition to reparations really does come from ignorance about the degree of the theft. And so that's why we have to get on the same page before we can turn it, right? That's why the TRHT is so important. I don't think you can read, you know, the Dallas community history and not realize that something must be repaired. I don't think you
Right.
can really look at things like the asset value of whiteness and all the reports that have been done at Demos and other places on the racial wealth gap and
Mhm.
see, you know, that Black and brown people have less than a dime in wealth for every dollar that white families have, and that a white high school dropout has more household wealth than a Black person who's graduated from college, right? That this isn't about
Mhm.
what we are doing. This is about decisions that were made in an explicitly racialized way, explicitly racist way, you know, before anything that we could ever try to do to close the gap. I
Right.
don't think you can really dig into that and face it and not realize that something must be done. But here's where it's running up against the zero sum, right? If your model is if you all get reparations, it's coming out of my pocket,
Right.
then, you know, particularly at a time when everybody is struggling economically, right? And everyone's having a hard time making ends meet, even before the pandemic, then you can be like, wait a second, you know,
Right.
I'm all for equality, but can you just get it somewhere else? And that's why it's so important to make the point that that reparations would come from the government, right? It would come from the government. It wouldn't come from white people, right? It wouldn't be like, you know, knock on your neighbor's door and cut a check, right? It would be about the entity that created the laws that forced white and Black people apart, that gave white people things for free for generations at the expense of Black people. That the government is who did that. It wasn't white people who, you know, writ large, who were the ones, you know, doing it. It was government policy. And so it's important for the government to pay.
Mhm.
Sandy Darity has a very good book out this year called From
Yeah.
Here to Equality, which really just sort of looks at how it would happen, how reparations could happen, and
Mhm.
makes it seem very doable. You know, in many ways, it's like I'm not personally, although I have no problem, you know, for people who are, I'm not personally like waiting on my check, right? It's not like it's not something that I think um, is needed. I think it's needed for our country. I don't think we can flourish without it. You know,
Mhm.
it's really about the benefit of our entire society, both in terms of healing and, you know, I mean, one of the things I say in my book is, you know, Black people in America have given us like open heart surgery, the math to return the moon landing, gas furnace, right? Like all of these incredible things with nothing, right? And with every possible obstacle. Just imagine
Right.
what it'd be like if, you know, those same Black families that have been robbed and robbed generation after generation had, you know, $10,000 in the bank to be
Mhm.
able to cushion the storms and to be able to invest in that business and to be able to, you know, pay for college without going into debt, right? Like this is the type of thing that white families got for free and that allowed the success that, you know, white families are experiencing today relative to families of color. So let's give everyone that opportunity.
Great. Last question before we let you go. What is making you hopeful in these times? You know, we
The
have
Dallas
so much
TRHT
happening.
is making me hopeful.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Oh, it's really true. I'm so sorry that I can't stay for the afternoon to hear about what is next, but I'm sure I'll loop
Yeah,
back around and find out what the plan is.
for sure.
If this book is the bestseller that I hope it is, you will get some calls because
Awesome. Awesome.
I definitely spotlight what you're all doing, and I'm so proud and so grateful.
No, thank you so much for being here with us and taking some time out of your morning to be with us.
Yeah.
We really appreciate you, and we cannot wait to the release of your book.